Lecture Vedic Religious Ideals Part 1. What concerns us most is the religious thought on soul and God and all that appertains to religion. We will take the Samhitas. These are collection of hymns forming, as it were, the oldest Aryan literature, properly speaking, the oldest literature in the world. There may have been some scraps of literature of older date here and there, older than that even, but not books or literature properly so called. As a collected book, this is the oldest the world has, and herein is portrayed the earliest feeling of the Aryans, their aspirations, the questions that arose about their manners and methods, and so on. At the very outset, we find a very curious idea. These hymns are sung in praise of different gods, devas as they are called, the bright ones. There is quite a number of them. One is called Indra, another Varun, another Mitra, Parjanya, and so on. Various mythological and allegorical features come before us one after the other. For instance, Indra, the thunderer, striking the serpent who has withheld the rains from mankind. Then he lets fly his thunderbolt, the serpent is killed. The rain comes down in showers. The people are pleased and they worship Indra with oblations. They make a sacrificial pyre, kill some animals, roast their flesh upon spits, and offer them that meat to Indra. And they had a popular plant called Som. What plant it was, nobody knows now. It has entirely disappeared, but from the books we gather that when crushed, it produced a sort of milky juice and that was fermented, and it can also be gathered from this fermented Som juice was intoxicating. This also they offered to Indra and the other gods, and they also drank it themselves. Sometimes they drank a little too much, and so did the gods. Indra on occasions got drunk. There are passages to show that Indra at one time drank so much of this Som juice that he talked irrelevant words. So with Varun. Here is another god very powerful and is in the same way protecting his votaries, and they are praising him with their libations of Som. So is the god of war, and so on. But the popular idea that strikes one as making the mythologies of the Samhitas entirely different from the other mythologies is that along with every one of these gods is the idea of an infinity. This infinite is abstracted and sometimes described as Aditya. At other times it is affixed, as it were, to all the other gods. Take for example Indra. In some of the books you will find that Indra has a body, is very strong, sometimes is wearing golden armor, and comes down, lives and eats with his votaries, fights the demons, fights the snakes, and so on. Again, in one hymn we find that Indra has been given a very high position. He is omnipresent and omnipotent, and Indra sees the heart of every being. So with Varun. This Varun is god of the air and is charge of the water, just as Indra was previously, and then all of a sudden we find him raised up and said to be omnipresent, omnipotent, and so on. I will read one passage about this Varun in his highest form, and you will understand what I mean. It has been translated into English poetry, so it is better, and I read it in that form. The mighty Lord on high our deeds, as if at hand espies. The God knows all men do, though men would fain their acts disguise. Whoever stands, whoever moves or steals from place to place, or hides him in his secret cell, the gods his movements trace. Wherever two together plot and deem they are alone, King Varun is there a third, and their schemes are known. This earth is his, to him belong those vast and boundless skies, both seas within him rest, and yet in that small pool he lies. Whoever far beyond the sky should think his way to wing, he could not there elude the grasp of Varun the king. His spies descending from the skies glide all this world around, their thousand eyes all scanning sweep to earth's remotest bound. So we can multiply examples about the other gods. They all come one after the other to share the same fate. They begin first as gods, and then they are raised to this conception as the being in whom the whole universe exists, who sees every heart, who is the ruler of the universe. And in the case of Varun, there is another idea, just the germ of one idea which came, but was immediately suppressed by the Aryan mind. And that was the idea of fear. In another place we read, they are afraid, they have sinned and asked Varun for pardon. These ideas were never allowed, for reasons you will come to understand later on, to grow on Indian soil. But the germs were there sprouting, the idea of fear and the idea of sin. This is the idea, as you all know, of what is called monotheism. This monotheism, we see, came to India at a very early period. Throughout the Samhitas, in the first and the oldest part, this monotheistic idea prevails. But we shall find that it did not prove sufficient for the Aryans. They threw it aside, as it were, as a very primitive sort of idea and went further on as we Hindus think. Of course, in reading books and criticism on the Vedas written by Europeans, the Hindus cannot help smiling when he reads that the writings of our authors are saturated with this previous education alone. Persons who have sucked in as their mother's milk the idea that the highest ideal of God is the idea of the personal God naturally dare not think on the lines of these ancient thinkers of India when they find that just after the Samhitas, the monotheistic idea with which the Samhita portion is replete was thought by the Aryans to be useless and not worthy of philosophers and thinkers, and that they struggle hard for a more philosophical and transcendental idea. The monotheistic idea was such too human for them, although they gave it such descriptions as the whole universe rests in him, and thou art the keeper of all hearts. The Hindus were bold, to their great credit be it said, bold thinkers in all their ideas, so bold that one spark of their thought frightens the so-called bold thinkers of the West. Well, has it been said by Professor Max Muller about these thinkers that they climbed up to heights where their lungs could only breathe and where those of other beings would have burst? These brave people followed reason wherever it led them, no matter at what cost, never caring if all their best superstitions were smashed to pieces, never caring what society would think about them or talk about them, but what they thought was right and true, they preached and they taught. Before going into all these speculations of the ancient Vedic sages, we will first refer to one or two very curious instances in the Vedas. The peculiar fact that these gods are taken up, as it were, one after the other, raised and sublimated, till each has assumed the proportions of the infinite personal God of the universe, calls for an explanation. Professor Max Muller creates for it a new name, as he thinks it peculiar to the Hindus. He calls it henotheism. We need not go far for the explanation, it is within the book. A few steps from the very place where we find those gods being raised and sublimated, we find the explanation also. The question arises how the Hindu mythologies should be so unique, so different from all others. In Babylonian or Greek mythologies, we find one god struggling upwards and he assumes a position and remains there while the other gods die out. Of all the Molochs, Jehovah becomes supreme, and the other Molochs are forgotten, lost forever. He is the god of gods. So too, of all the Greek gods, Zeus comes to the front and assumes big proportions, becomes the god of the universe, and all the other gods become degraded into minor angels. This fact was repeated in later times. The Buddhists and the Jains raised one of their prophets to the godhead, and all the other gods they made subservient to Buddha or to Jinnah. This is the worldwide process, but there we find an exception, as it were. One god is praised for, and for the time being it is said that all the other gods obey his commands. And the very one who is said to be raised up by Varun is himself raised up in the next book to the highest position. They occupy the position of the personal god in turns. But the explanation is there in the book and it is a grand explanation, one that has given the theme to all subsequent thought in India, and one that will be the theme of the whole world of religions. Ekam Sat Vipra Bahuda Vadanti. That which exists is one, sages call it by various names. In all these cases where hymns were written about all these gods. In all these cases where hymns were written about all these gods, the being perceived was one and the same. It was the perceiver who made the difference. It was the hymnist, the sage, the poet who sang in different languages and different words the praise of one and the same being. That which exists is one, sages call it by various names. Tremendous results have followed from that one verse. Some of you perhaps are surprised to think that India is the only country where there never has been a religious persecution, where never was any man disturbed for his religious faith. Theists or atheists, monoists, dualist monotheists are there and always live unmolested. Materialists were allowed to preach from the steps of Brahmanical temples against the gods and against God himself. They went preaching all over the land that the idea of God was a mere superstition and that gods and Vedas and religion was simply superstitions invented by the priests for their own benefit, and they are allowed to do this unmolested. And so wherever he went, Buddha tried to pull down every old thing sacred to the Hindus to the dust, and Buddha died of ripe old age. So did the Jains, who laughed at the idea of God. How can it be that there is a God, they asked. It must be a mere superstition. So on, endless examples there are. Before the Mohammedan wave came into India, it was never known what religious persecution was. The Hindus had only experienced it as made by foreigners on themselves. And even now it is a patent fact how much Hindus have helped to build Christian churches and how much readiness there is to help them. There never had been bloodshed. Even heterodox religions that have come out of India have been likewise affected. For instance, Buddhism. Buddhism is a great religion in some respects, but to confuse Buddhism with Vedanta is without meaning. Anyone may mark just the difference that exists between Christianity and the Salvation Army. There are great and good points in Buddhism, but these great points fell into hands which were not able to keep them safe. The jewels which came from philosophers fell into the hand of mobs, and the mobs took up their ideas. They had a great deal of enthusiasm, some marvelous ideas, great and humanitarian ideas, but after all, there is something else that is necessary, thought and intellect, to keep everything safe. Wherever you see the most humanitarian ideas fall into the hands of the multitude, the first result you may notice is degradation. It is learning and intellect that keeps things sure. Now this Buddhism went as the first missionary religion to the world, penetrated the whole of the civilized world as it existed at that time, and never was a drop of blood shed for that religion. We read how in China the Buddhist missionaries were persecuted and thousands were massacred by 2 or 3 successive emperors, but after that, fortune favored the Buddhists, and one of the emperors offered to take the vengeance on the persecutors, but the missionaries refused. All that we owe to this one verse. That is why I want you to remember it. Whom they call Indra, Mitra, Varun, that which exists is one, sages call it by various names.